She wrote one of the most beloved Christian hymns in history, a song about seeing Jesus clearly. Yet by the time those words were written, she could no longer see at all. This is the mystery. A woman whose world had gone dark taught generations where to fix their eyes. Her name was Helen Howarth Lemmel, and long before blindness claimed her sight, life had already begun to take everything else. But to understand the power of her story, we must return to the beginning, to a young girl in Victorian England whose future once seemed brilliantly lit. Helen was born in 1864, into a world where a woman's worth was often measured by her usefulness, her obedience, her silence. But even as a child, Helen carried something that refused to be quiet: music. It was evident early, not merely talent, but depth. When she touched the piano, people stopped to listen. When she sang, rooms softened. Her gift opened doors most girls of her time would never enter. She was trained at the prestigious Royal Academy of Music, surrounded by promise, discipline, and applause. In those years, Helen learned to trust her voice, to believe that excellence could secure her future, to think, like many women do, that faithfulness and hard work would somehow protect her from loss. She crossed borders. She crossed oceans. Europe, America, concert halls, classrooms. Her name carried respect. Her voice carried authority. And then she married. For Helen, marriage was not an escape from calling, but a hope of companionship, a belief that love would walk beside her gift, not silence it. But this is where the story begins to turn, quietly at first, a blur in her vision, a shadow she could not sing away, a weakness no amount of discipline could correct. As her eyesight began to fail, so did something else: the devotion of the man who had vowed to stay. In an era where a woman's value was tied to her ability, blindness was not merely a condition, it was a sentence. Her husband left, not with drama, not with scandal, but with absence. And suddenly, Helen learned a lesson many women know too well, that love built on usefulness cannot survive weakness. The applause faded. The invitations stopped. The world she had worked so hard to enter slowly closed its doors. And as the darkness crept into her eyes, another darkness pressed in, the kind that whispers questions late at night. Who am I if I can no longer perform? Who am I if I am no longer chosen? Who am I if everything I built my life upon is taken away? By her early 50s, Helen Howarth Lemmel was completely blind. Once celebrated, now invisible. Once admired, now alone. And yet, this is not where her story ends, because in the silence, in the poverty, in the small, dim room where the world had forgotten her name, God was preparing her to see something no amount of eyesight could ever reveal. And what she would soon write would outlive her suffering, outlast her obscurity, and guide millions of weary women through their own darkness. But first, Helen would have to lose everything she thought she needed to finally discover where true vision begins. She was still alive, but to the world, Helen Howarth Lemmel had already disappeared. This is the mystery of the middle years, the place where most women's stories are quietly buried, not in scandal, not in triumph, but in silence. Blindness had taken her sight, but it did not take her memory, and memory can be a cruel companion. She remembered the applause, the way rooms once leaned forward when she sang. She remembered being introduced by name, being sought after, being certain that her gift would carry her safely through life. Now her days were measured differently, by footsteps she could not see approaching, by voices that spoke about her instead of to her, by the careful counting of coins, the rationing of food, the quiet fear of becoming a burden. This is not the kind of suffering that arrives with drama. It arrives with routine. Each morning, Helen woke to darkness, not the dramatic darkness of night, but the unchanging kind that does not lift with sunrise. She had to relearn the world by touch, by sound, by patience. Things she once did without thought now required courage, walking alone, eating alone, asking for help from strangers who did not know the woman she used to be. For women, this loss cuts deeply, because so often our sense of worth is stitched into what we can do, how well we do it, and how others respond. Helen had been exceptional. Now she was dependent, and dependency has a way of exposing what applause once concealed. Her husband was gone, not because she lacked faith, but because she lacked usefulness. No grand betrayal, no loud argument, just absence. And absence can wound more deeply than cruelty ever could. There were no children to anchor her days, no legacy she could point to and say, "At least this remains." Only God, and even He felt painfully quiet. This is the season where faith is no longer inherited, no longer borrowed, no longer sustained by momentum. This is where faith either deepens or dies. Helen lived in mission housing supported by Christian charity, a humbling mercy that came with invisible costs. To be helped is one thing, to be forgotten is another. Visitors came less often, former colleagues moved on. The world did not pause to grieve her loss, and in that obscurity, the enemy whispers the same lies he has whispered to women for centuries. You were valuable only while you were visible. You mattered only while you were admired. God used you once, but now He has moved on. But Helen did something extraordinary. She stayed. She stayed in Scripture. She stayed in prayer. She stayed in hope, even when hope felt unreasonable. She listened as the Bible was read aloud, letting familiar passages take on new weight. Verses about light spoken into a life of darkness. Promises about sight given to a woman who could not see. And then, one ordinary day, someone placed a small missionary tract into her hands. No ceremony, no prophetic moment, just paper, ink, words. Written by another woman, a missionary who had also surrendered comfort, ambition, and recognition for the sake of Christ. As the tract was read to her, one sentence arrested her spirit. "Turn your eyes upon Jesus." The phrase lingered. Turn your eyes. Helen could not turn her eyes toward anything, and yet she realized she had been doing exactly that all along, turning her gaze inward, toward grief, toward loss, toward what might have been. And in that moment, a revelation unfolded. That physical sight had never guaranteed spiritual clarity. That darkness could become a sanctuary if Christ was present within it. Helen understood something many never do, that God does not waste seasons of invisibility, that the years no one sees are often the years heaven is shaping something eternal. And so she began to write, slowly, carefully, with words formed in surrender, not ambition. She wrote of a Christ so consuming that sorrow fades beside Him, of a glory so steady that circumstances lose their grip. The hymn was not written from victory, but from yielding, not from healing, but from trust. And this is the lesson that echoes for women everywhere, that when life narrows, God deepens, that when doors close, He opens the eyes of the heart. Helen did not know that these words would one day travel farther than her feet ever could again. She did not know that her blindness would give sight to others. She only knew this, that she had lost everything except Jesus, and that He was still enough. But what happens when a song born in darkness escapes the room it was written in? What happens when God lifts a whisper and makes it echo across the world? That is where the story moves next. The world never came back for her. This is the truth most stories soften, that faithfulness does not always end in restoration, and obedience is not always rewarded with recognition. Helen Howarth Lemmel would never stand again on a grand stage. She would never regain her sight. She would never reclaim the life she once imagined. And yet, her song was already on the move, quietly at first, passed from hand to hand, from church to church, from one weary soul to another. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. Words written in a small, dim room began filling sanctuaries Helen would never enter. They rose during revivals she would never see. They carried comfort to women kneeling beside hospital beds, to mothers grieving children, to wives praying through abandonment, to daughters wondering if their quiet faith mattered at all. The irony is almost unbearable. A woman the world no longer noticed was shaping how the world would worship, and Helen knew very little of it. She remained in poverty, her days unchanged, her circumstances unrescued. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, especially for women who have been taught that obedience guarantees visible blessing. Helen's blessing was not visible, it was eternal. While others sang her words, she continued to depend on the kindness of strangers. While choirs swelled with her hymn, she measured life in simple mercies: warm meals, safe shelter, the voice of Scripture read aloud. And yet, there is no bitterness recorded, no resentment preserved in her writings, no evidence of regret, only quiet faith. This is the kind of holiness that rarely trends, the kind that refuses to demand applause. Helen lived into her 90s, her body aging in darkness, her song growing brighter with each passing year. By the time she died in 1961, the hymn had already traveled across continents. Generations were singing words written by a woman they would never know by name. And this is the final lesson of her life: that God's economy does not operate on visibility, that usefulness is not measured by productivity, that a woman's worth does not diminish when her influence becomes hidden. Helen lost her marriage, she lost her career, she lost her sight, but she did not lose her calling, because calling is not something you perform, it is something you carry. And sometimes God allows everything else to be stripped away so that what remains is pure. For women who feel overlooked, for women whose best years seem behind them, for women serving faithfully in quiet corners where no one claps and no one notices, Helen's life whispers a truth the world rarely affirms. You are not invisible to God. You are not finished because circumstances changed. You are not disqualified because life grew small. Some of heaven's loudest echoes begin as whispers in the dark. Helen Howarth Lemmel never saw the impact of her obedience, but heaven did. And every time her hymn is sung, every time a weary soul lifts their eyes away from loss and toward Christ, her story continues. She lost her sight, but she taught the world where to look. And in the end, that was enough. Long after her voice fell silent, long after her name faded from memory, Helen Howarth Lemmel continued to speak. Not through interviews, not through recognition, but through the quiet persistence of truth. This is the act we rarely tell, the one that reaches beyond her lifetime and confronts ours. Because Helen's story does not end with her death. It ends every time a woman stands at the edge of her own darkness and wonders if God still sees her. Helen died as she lived her final decades, without applause, without wealth, without public honor. No grand obituary, no procession of admirers. just a woman laid to rest, and a hymn that refused to die. And this, perhaps, is the most confronting truth of all, that God allowed her to remain unseen so that her message could remain uncontaminated by ego. The world loves stories of comeback. God often writes stories of continuance. Helen never got her sight back, never got her husband back, never reclaimed the life she lost, but she gained something far rarer, a faith that no longer depended on outcomes. And for women, this matters deeply, because many are still waiting for recognition, waiting for validation, waiting for God to prove that their suffering meant something. Helen's life answers that question gently but firmly. Meaning is not proven by reward. Faithfulness is not validated by visibility. Some women are called to shine publicly. Others are called to burn steadily in hidden places, warming generations they will never meet. Helen belonged to the second. Her hymn found its way into hospitals, where women whispered it through tears, into prisons, where hope had worn thin, into quiet bedrooms where prayers felt unanswered and faith felt fragile. And the things of earth will grow strangely dim, not because pain disappears, but because Christ becomes clearer. Helen never stood before the crowds again, but she stood before God, empty-handed, faithful, surrendered, and heaven counted that as victory. This is the lesson our culture resists, that a woman's legacy does not require an audience, that obedience does not demand affirmation, that your most impactful season may be the one no one documents. Helen's life reminds us that God does not abandon women when they age, when they weaken, when they lose what once made them impressive. He meets them there, in the dark rooms, in the narrow lives, in the overlooked years. And he says, "Look at me." Helen did, and because she did, millions still do. She lost her sight, but she found vision. She lost the world, but she gained eternity. And for every woman who fears that her best days are gone, that her faith is unnoticed, that her sacrifices are unseen, Helen's story stands as a quiet, defiant witness. God is not finished with you when life grows small. Sometimes that is when your song finally begins. This is where the story turns inward, because Helen Howarth Lemmel's life is no longer only about her. It is about you, about every woman who has ever whispered, "Is this all there is?" About every woman who has watched the life she planned quietly slip through her fingers. Helen's story confronts us with a sacred question. What do you do when God does not restore what you lost, but asks you to trust Him anyway? For Helen, there was no final miracle on this side of eternity. No regained sight, no public vindication, no return to the life she once knew. And yet, her faith did not shrink. It deepened. This is the kind of faith most of us are never taught to desire. A faith that survives without applause. A faith that does not require answers. A faith that chooses Christ even when the outcome feels unbearably unfair. Helen lived nearly a century, long enough to watch generations rise and fall, long enough to feel time slow around her, long enough to learn that joy is not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of God within it. Her hymn did not promise escape, it promised perspective. Not that trials would disappear, but that they would lose their power when placed beside eternity. And this is where Helen's life speaks most tenderly to women, because women are often taught to endure quietly, to sacrifice endlessly, to carry pain with grace, yet rarely told that God sees every hidden tear. Helen's obedience was not loud, it was not glamorous, but it was faithful. She teaches us that calling does not end when circumstances change, that usefulness does not expire when productivity slows, that a woman's worth is not measured by how much she can still give. Sometimes God asks a woman to be, not to do, to remain, to trust, to look to Him when everything else grows dim. Helen's life invites us to loosen our grip on outcomes, on timelines, on the version of the future we thought God owed us, because what He offers instead is Himself. And for those who dare to accept that exchange, there is a peace the world cannot touch. Helen's body weakened, her world narrowed, but her soul expanded. She learned that surrender is not defeat, that obscurity can be holy ground, that even in the dark, God is still writing. And when her life finally ended, Helen stepped into a light she had waited decades to see. Not dim, not fading, but eternal. This is the invitation her story leaves behind, to turn your eyes, not away from pain, but beyond it, to lift your gaze, not toward what was lost, but toward who remains. Because when everything else is stripped away, Christ is still enough. And if a blind, forgotten woman could trust Him completely, so can you. And now, the story comes to its quiet conclusion, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with the question that lingers long after the song fades. What does it mean to live a life that God sees, even when the world does not? Helen Howarth Lemmel never stood at the center of history. She did not command armies. She did not lead movements. She did not leave behind monuments carved with her name. And yet, her life has outlasted many who did, because God does not measure legacy the way the world does. He measures it by obedience in the dark, by trust without guarantees, by love that does not withdraw when suffering stays. Helen's life was not loud, but it was true. And that truth continues to find women right where they are. Women who are tired of being strong, women who feel reduced to roles they never chose, women who are faithful but weary, women whose prayers feel unanswered and whose sacrifices feel unnoticed. Helen stands beside them, not as a hero, but as a witness that faith does not require understanding, a witness that God's nearness is not proven by comfort, a witness that the smallest offering, given in surrender, can echo into eternity. She teaches us something the world rarely celebrates, that a woman does not fail when her life becomes quiet. Sometimes that is when it becomes holy. Helen did not cling to bitterness. She did not demand explanations. She did not negotiate with God. She trusted Him, not because life made sense, but because He remained faithful when everything else fell away. And in that trust, she found freedom from comparison, freedom from regret, freedom from the need to be seen. She learned to rest her worth not in what she had lost, but in who held her. And this is where her story gently reaches for yours, because perhaps you too are standing in a season you did not choose, a season of loss or limitation or quiet obedience. Perhaps your life looks smaller than you imagined it would. Perhaps the world has moved on while you remain. Helen's life whispers this truth into that place. God has not moved on from you. He is present in the unseen years. He is near in the unanswered prayers. He is faithful in the narrow places. And when the noise fades, when expectations fall away, when the world grows strangely dim, there He is, waiting, not asking you to be impressive, not asking you to be strong, only asking you to look to Him. Helen could not see with her eyes, but she saw with her soul, and because she did, countless others have learned to do the same. Her life did not end in darkness. It ended in light. And so will yours. If you keep your eyes not on what you have lost, not on what you fear, not on what the world demands, but on Jesus. Because when you do, even the darkest seasons become places of grace. And that is the quiet triumph of Helen Howarth Lemmel. And still, the song continues. Long after Helen Howarth Lemmel's footsteps faded from the earth, long after her hands could no longer trace the pages of Scripture, long after her name slipped quietly into history's margins, her voice remained. Not her singing voice, but her surrendered one. This is the final mystery of her life, that God allowed her body to weaken, her world to narrow, and her story to remain largely untold, yet He amplified her obedience beyond her lifetime. Because God is not finished when a woman's life looks finished. Helen's hymn does not belong to a moment in history. It belongs to moments of breaking. Moments when women sit alone in rooms filled with questions they never thought they would have to ask. Moments when faith feels fragile, when dreams feel distant, when life feels smaller than promised. And in those moments, the words return again and again. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, not because circumstances suddenly change, but because you do. Helen's story teaches us that spiritual maturity is not learning how to escape pain, it is learning where to look while enduring it. She never pretended suffering was holy. She never romanticized loss. She simply refused to let it become the lens through which she interpreted God. And this is a lesson many women must relearn, especially those who have carried disappointment quietly. You are not weak because you grieve. You are not faithless because you struggle. You are not forgotten because your life feels hidden. Helen's life stands as evidence that God often entrusts His deepest truths to those who have nothing left to lose. Her blindness sharpened her focus. Her poverty purified her devotion. Her obscurity freed her from performing faith. And in that freedom, she found something the world could never offer, a steady, unshakable gaze upon Christ. This is not a story about resignation. It is a story about resolve, the resolve to keep believing when belief costs everything, the resolve to keep loving God when He does not explain Himself, the resolve to trust that a life surrendered in secret is still a life well lived. Helen never saw the impact of her obedience, but heaven did, and heaven is still responding. Every time a woman lifts her eyes away from shame, away from regret, away from fear, her song rises again. Every time someone chooses faith over despair, her obedience echoes. And this is where her story leaves us, not with answers, not with guarantees, but with an invitation to stop measuring our lives by what we have lost, to stop defining our worth by what the world affirms, to believe, like Helen did, that God is enough, even when nothing else is restored. Because one day, every hidden sacrifice will be revealed, every quiet faith will be honored, every tear will be redeemed. And on that day, Helen Howarth Lemmel will finally see the full glory of the one she trusted in the dark. Until then, her life continues to whisper to ours. Keep looking, keep trusting, keep singing, even if no one hears, because God does, and that has always been enough. There is a moment, often late at night, when the world grows quiet enough for the truth to surface. It is in that stillness that Helen Howarth Lemmel's story finds us, not as history, not as biography, but as a mirror. Because her life asks a question that reaches into the hidden places of a woman's heart. Who are you when no one is watching? Helen learned the answer slowly, through loss that did not reverse, through prayers that were not answered the way she hoped, through years that did not circle back to the life she once knew. She learned that identity built on ability will always collapse, that worth anchored in usefulness will eventually be shaken, that faith tethered to outcomes cannot survive suffering. And so God did something severe and kind. He removed the scaffolding until only the foundation remained. For many women, this is the most frightening work of God, because it feels like abandonment when it is actually refinement. Helen's blindness did not mean God withdrew, it meant he drew closer. Her poverty did not disqualify her, it purified her. Her obscurity did not erase her influence, it multiplied it. This is the lesson the world resists, but heaven insists upon, that God is most present when life feels most reduced. Helen did not fight her limitations with resentment. She did not bargain with God for visibility. She did not demand proof that her suffering mattered. She trusted him in the dark, and that trust became light for others. Women who hear her story often recognize a familiar ache, the ache of being capable yet constrained, the ache of having something to give yet nowhere obvious to place it, the ache of wondering whether quiet faith still counts. Helen answers that ache gently. Yes, it counts more than you know, because God is not searching for platforms, he is searching for hearts, and a heart fully surrendered will always outshine a life loudly admired. Helen's hymn does not invite us to deny reality, it invites us to reinterpret it, to see pain through the lens of eternity, to see loss through the promise of glory, to see ourselves not as forgotten women, but as held daughters. Her life tells us that we do not need to be rescued from suffering, to be redeemed within it. And perhaps this is the most freeing truth of all, that your life does not need to make sense to be meaningful, that your obedience does not need witnesses to be powerful, that God can use the seasons you would erase to create something you could never imagine. Helen never saw her influence, but her influence sees us. It finds women in kitchens, in hospital rooms, in grief and exhaustion, in joy and quiet faithfulness, and it whispers the same invitation she accepted. Lift your eyes, not to what was, not to what might have been, but to what remains eternal. Because when you do, the darkness does not disappear, but it no longer defines you. Helen's life was not a tragedy, it was a testimony that a woman does not need a perfect ending to live a faithful life. She only needs to keep looking to Jesus, and in doing so, she discovers, even in the dark, that she is never alone. At the very end of everything, when all explanations fall silent, there remains only one question. Was it worth it? Not the suffering, not the loss, but the faith. Helen Howarth Lemmel never had the luxury of seeing her story tied neatly together. She lived with unanswered questions until her final breath. And yet, her life stands as a quiet, unshakable yes. Yes, it was worth trusting God when obedience cost her visibility. Yes, it was worth loving him when life did not return the favor. Yes, it was worth surrendering control when nothing was restored. Because Helen discovered something many never do, that God himself is the reward. Her life teaches women that faith is not proven by outcomes, but by endurance. By showing up in prayer when joy feels distant, by choosing gratitude when resentment would be easier, by clinging to hope when circumstances offer none. Helen's years in darkness were not wasted years. They were weight-bearing years, years that carried the quiet strength of a woman rooted in Christ. And this is the part of the story that confronts us most honestly, because it asks us whether we are willing to follow God without guarantees, to trust him without timelines, to remain faithful without applause. Helen did. And in doing so, she redefined what a successful life looks like. Not achievement, not recognition, not restoration, but surrender. She teaches us that the truest worship is not sung from stages, but from lives laid down. That the loudest testimony is often lived, not spoken. that a woman's greatest impact may unfold long after she is gone. Helen's hymn does not promise ease, it promises focus. A focus that steadies the heart when life unravels. A focus that anchors the soul when circumstances disappoint. And this is where her story meets ours, at the crossroads of choice. Will we fix our eyes on what we lost, or on who remains? Will we define our worth by seasons that passed, or by the God who never leaves? Helen chose Christ, again and again, without knowing what it would cost or what it would yield, and that choice echoes still. For women navigating grief, for women carrying silent disappointment, for women whose faith feels ordinary and unseen, Helen's life declares this truth: your obedience matters. Your faithfulness counts. Your story is not small. Even if no one claps, even if nothing changes, even if restoration never comes. Because one day, when all things are made new, you will see clearly what you trusted blindly. Helen Howarth Lemmel trusted in the dark, and in doing so, she stepped into a light that never fades. Her life answers the question at the end of all things. Yes, it was worth it. And now the story exhales, not because the weight of it is gone, but because it has been carried to its final meaning. Helen Howarth Lemmel's life does not end with a conclusion. It ends with an invitation whispered to every woman who has walked through loss and wondered whether her faith still mattered. Because Helen's story was never about blindness alone, it was about where she chose to look. She did not pretend the darkness was light. She did not deny the ache of what was taken. She did not spiritualize her pain to make it easier to bear. She simply turned, again and again, toward Christ. And that turning changed everything. Not her circumstances, not her comfort, not her recognition, but her vision. Helen learned that the truest clarity often comes when the world grows dim, that when distractions fall away, what remains is what matters most. And for women, this lesson lands deeply, because women are often taught to define themselves by seasons, by youth, by usefulness, by visibility, by strength. Helen's life dismantles that lie. She shows us that a woman does not lose value when her seasons change. She gains depth. She shows us that God does not withdraw when our lives narrow. He moves closer. She shows us that faith does not require understanding, only trust. Helen's hymn does not call us to escape pain. It calls us to outgrow it, to place our suffering inside a larger story, to see our losses through the lens of eternity. And perhaps this is why her song endures, because it was written by a woman who had nothing left to cling to except God Himself. Her life asks us gently, what would happen if we stopped waiting for God to fix everything and started trusting Him to be enough? What if faith was not about getting answers, but about learning where to rest our gaze? Helen rested hers on Christ, and in doing so, she discovered a freedom no circumstance could steal, a peace that did not depend on sight, a joy that did not require restoration, a hope that did not fade with time. When Helen finally passed from this world, she did not leave behind wealth or titles or monuments. She left behind a truth, one that continues to steady hearts in moments of breaking, that when everything else grows dim, Christ does not. And so, the story ends where it always belonged, not with Helen, but with you, with your losses, with your questions, with your quiet faith. Because the same invitation she accepted is being offered again. Turn your eyes not away from reality, but toward hope. Look full, not at what failed, but at who remains faithful. And as you do, you will discover what Helen learned in the darkest season of her life, that even when the world fades, Christ shines brighter still. And that is enough. If this story found you in a quiet place, if Helen's journey echoed something in your own heart, then don't let it end here. Take a moment, right now, to turn your eyes where she did. If you are walking through loss, through waiting, through a season that feels unseen, you are not alone. Let this be your reminder that God still works in hidden places, and your faith still matters. If this story encouraged you, share it with a woman who needs hope today, someone who is tired, someone who feels forgotten, someone who wonders if her quiet obedience counts. Subscribe to Her Faith Echoes for more stories of women whose faith was forged in silence and whose courage still speaks. And in the comments, tell us, what are you learning to trust God with right now? Because when we lift our eyes together, even the darkest seasons begin to shine with meaning.